Welcome to a special edition of the Crazy Wisdom podcast. I am going to go into an article I recently wrote. For the past couple of years, I've been really interested in the question of whether we're in a dark age, a golden age, neither, or both. And so in that query, I've gone into the past and I've started to understand what was a dark age before. And the biggest one that comes to mind is the dark age of Western rational enlightenment tradition, where we had the ancient Greeks, the Greeks and Romans of antiquity. They built these massive empires, and then all of a sudden everything collapsed. And what I want to talk about is how knowledge disappeared in that time period, and then reappeared later once the Europeans found these works of antiquity. So the most interesting thing is that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, they believed that the main way that you transfer knowledge is through what I'm doing right now, is through essentially dialogue. But they didn't have video cameras, so what did they do? They were in the same physical space. Everybody congregated into the great city of Athens, and they all talked it out, basically. And when they were talking it out, their main form of training was in articulation and how to say something rather than just the content of what you say. I'm sure that according to their standards, this talk would be ridiculous because I'm just going on improv right now. And so they got together in the same physical space and they talked it out. But then towards Alexander's reign, when Alexander took over much of the Western Europe, it was Eastern Europe and Asia Minor, Egypt, all of those different places. He set up something that would form as the foundation for what would later come in the Western Enlightenment tradition as the library, the Great Library of Alexandria. So not only did you have people getting together and having public speeches and figuring things out, you also started to have scrolls, books, proto-books, because the book as we know it didn't exist at that point, but the great works, and they started to store the great works. And this was an adjunct to the way that they got together and they spoke together. Now they had in the same physical space a lot of literature that they could look to, and they started to capture knowledge in these libraries. And that was the main thing that they had innovated on before the fall, before the Dark Ages started to take over. And then as the Roman Empire turned into an empire from the Senate, from a republic, they had a lot of libraries as well. And they started to create, and then Jesus Christ came, and he, at first it was just a part of Judaism, a strange cult in Judaism, but then it started to become popular within the Roman Empire itself. And so the Roman Empire starts to fall. Usually people placed it at around 200 AD when some real problems started to appear in the Roman Empire. And then slowly over time, over a couple hundred years, as the empire was falling, Christianity became the state religion of Rome. And there were early church fathers. The early church fathers were the apostles or people who came later who started to talk with the apostles, understand what Jesus said. They basically started to use the Roman road network, which was still functioning at the time, to write letters to each other. And those letters became what was now known as the New Testament. And that New Testament was basically the dogma of the early church. You also had the Nicene Council, the Council of Nicaea, which formulated these early thoughts about what Jesus was, and basically created what we have today as the modern church. And this modern church basically created a dogma as the Roman Empire was falling. And then all of this knowledge of antiquity was basically disappeared. It disappeared within the collective conscious. An interesting fact I learned is that within Byzantium in Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire, all of whom called themselves Roman, the scholars there actually kept it alive, but only among the scholars. The kind of great collective consciousness, and only 10% of Rome was literate. So among those 10% of people, that fell away, that disappeared. So people just stopped paying attention to what was going on because they had bigger problems to worry about, including plague, barbarians at the gates. And so they stopped wrestling with these ideas. And essentially the only thing for about 1,000 years was how well you could attune to the word of God as presented through these letters, early letters of the church father. And so that brings in the primacy of the written word. So as you can see, if you want to read the article that I wrote, that is a tradition that the Greeks and Romans wouldn't have done. They wouldn't have think, oh, okay, I'm going to go read this thing. But we do have that thing, and that's based on early monasteries. As the Roman Empire was falling, basically the material world was becoming in shambles. And so the idea of asceticism, while the world's falling apart, it makes sense to go become an ascetic in the forest. And so they created these monasteries. And in these monasteries, they rewrote they had to keep these letters alive. And so they had to copy them onto pieces of paper. Now, pieces of paper were very scarce. And so they didn't have a lot of pieces of paper. So they needed to reuse old pieces of paper. And guess what was written on them? The works of great antiquity. So these early monks started to destroy the great works of antiquity and copy over them. And the only reason that we have them now is because some of these monks, I think in the 11th century, 12th century, they started to realize what was written on these and rediscover these ancient works. A lot of these ancient works also came through the Arabs. The Arabs got them, particularly once they destroyed the city of Constantinople and found a lot of the literature from ancient Rome, and they reintroduced it, particularly during the Crusades as well. So the written word was really important, and it started to become more important, particularly once these monasteries turned into the early forms of the university. And in Milan, I think it was, one of the first universities arose out of this monastic tradition. And then as the Enlightenment was really heating up, you got something called the Republic of Letters. And the Republic of and to study his natural world, letters together in a sort of early form of the internet. And as that was evolving, the printing press came around and people started to create books as well. But an interesting thing a lot of people don't realize is the relationship between this Republic of Letters and book writing. When Galileo and Copernicus started to write their books that were heretical, that were deemed heretical about the primacy of the sun within our solar system, they actually timed it strategically with this Republic of Letters. They would all write to each other with letters saying, oh, I'm about to publish this. Oh, maybe you should wait, kind of like slowly entering this. And then they published the books when they thought the timing was right. Obviously, there was no real good way to convince people at that time that the earth revolved around the sun. So they were still deemed heretical. And so we've got the Republic of Letters, we've got books, most of these things about the primacy of the written word, not so much in person speaking, although we do have that later on with the idea of a seminar within a university. But then there's one more piece, which is the museum. So these natural philosophers, the early term for what is now known as a scientist today, they would go over the world studying the natural world, and then they would bring back artifacts back to their home, and they would create museums. Because knowledge itself, what I'm doing right now, I'm doing a transfer of knowledge with words, but knowledge itself is not limited to the words. It's also, for example, physical objects. The physical object, particularly like an ancient Persian statue, it elicits an emotion inside of you that can't be conveyed in words. It can, but it's very difficult to convey in words. So they created these museums to spark wonder in people. And those museums were basically the first form of virtual reality, which is becoming the digital equivalent to these ancient museums, where not only do you have the written word, the ability to read and write words, but you also have the ability to create virtual environments, which spark wonder, joy, fear, all of these other things. And then all of that evolved into what we know of as the internet today. And that's why I'm doing this, is because I want to understand what is knowledge management, and what will it become in the age of AI. Thank you for listening.